Hello and welcome to the Horticulturalists. I'm Stephen Ryan.
And I'm Matthew Lucas.
And we post a video every week. So why not hit subscribe and the alert button to remind you every Friday.
Indeed. And if you've got a burning horticultural question for Mr. Ryan, put it in the comments below. Tell us where you're from in the world and he will try and answer it in 60 seconds every Monday.
Yes, so there you go. You get us twice a week if you really want us.
If you're lucky.
Now this week,
Yes,
we are going to look at a very practical technique in gardening that is not often used. And this particular plant, Lapageria rosea, reminded me.
Well, there you go. Now we've included Lapageria in a few things.
Yeah.
We've actually made a standalone video about it. We've included it in Rare and Wonderful Climbers, and we also made a film about Chilean plants that you grow. And this, of course, features. I mean, look at those flowers; they're absolutely stunning. Now, here's the thing, then.
Yeah.
Why is it uncommon to find Lapageria?
Well, Lapageria is one of those plants that one could say is a little bit sort of temperamental. Perhaps an aristocrat that requires very careful managing if you're going to get what you want from it. And unfortunately, one of the reasons why you don't see it around very often, and when you do occasionally come across it for sale in nurseries, it's nearly always far more expensive than every other climber that you can imagine. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Lapageria is not terribly hard to raise from seed, but you need to have two cross-pollinating clones to get seed that's viable to start with. And the seedlings from two cross-pollinating clones could be any colour.
Not look like mummy or daddy.
Exactly. So, I mean, this soft pink one, which is one called Rosado Fuerte, if I was to raise seed from this one, it might throw some whites, it might throw some dark cherry reds, which is more the wild colour of Lapageria. So you can't guarantee you're going to get anything like this. And even if you get something like it, genetically it won't be exactly the same plant. So if I want this one, I have to grow it vegetatively, and Lapageria will not strike from cuttings. Or at least nobody's found the technique to my knowledge. So if somebody knows how to do it, let me know, because I'm desperate to find out. So
Today
we're going to talk about a propagating technique that you can use to create clonal Lapagerias. So if I want some more of this Rosado Fuerte, I can propagate them. And you can also use this technique for a whole range of other plants. So although we're using Lapageria as a sort of sample or specimen that we're working with, any climbing plant with sort of nice soft stems that are easily manageable and easily moved and bent can probably be serpentine layering. And that's what we're doing. We're going to do serpentine layering.
Serpentine layering. And we've got a bit of a collection of sort of techniques. So we've done one on seed germination. We have done one on cuttings. So this is going to be serpentine layering.
Yes, and it is a specific sort of layering. Most people have heard of layering something down into a pot or into the ground. People have talked about air layering, which is basically layering up on a plant that you can't get down to the ground, although I do find that a very fiddly technique to grow things by. And there's stool layering. There's a whole range of different ways of doing it. But serpentine layering is a particularly useful technique for climbing plants because you can get quite a lot of plants out of a comparatively small amount of material.
Okay, well, I think without further ado, we're going to the polytunnel.
Yes.
To find out how to serpentine layer.
Let's do just that.
Let's go. Well, Stephen, I have a wreath to decorate myself with.
Yes.
Now, it's a great day to be in the polytunnel because it's freezing outside. It is midwinter here in Australia. We've been in your polytunnel a few times, Stephen.
Yes, we have. We've done a few things in here. We did some seed raising. We have also potted a Varroa rhododendron into a piece of tree fern log.
But today we're going to do serpentine layering. Now, the species you've chosen today, or the plant you've chosen today, is not Lapageria, but what have you chosen?
All right, well, this is one of the Trachelospermums, the star jasmines. It's one that I've never been able to satisfactorily find a proper name for. I was given it as Trachelospermum unanensis, but I can't find a reference to unanensis anywhere. So at this stage, it's an unnamed species.
Well, let's talk about it though, because this foliage has the most beautiful russet colour, and I can see some really scarlet reds here.
Yes.
Now, are these old leaves? Is it deciduous? What's happening with the leaf colour?
Now this is a winter-induced colour. So if you're in a frost-free environment, don't expect to get this colour. So it's basically the cold that's bringing the colour up in the foliage.
Ah, right.
So it works very well at Macedon, where we do get some frosts and things in the winter.
Yeah.
But if you were to take this to Melbourne, I think it would stay green the whole time.
Right.
And these leaves will go back to green in the summer. So it's not a deciduous thing getting ready to shed its leaves. The leaves are being coloured by cold, and they will go back to being a normal colour as the spring comes on.
Isn't that an amazing physics and chemistry-like adaptation, that the pigment can change, just keep going backwards and forwards?
And I don't quite know why, but then I'm a gardener, not a chemist. So there you go.
Fascinating. You know, maybe the elixir of youth is in this.
Who knows? We can all pray and hope.
Okay.
So anyhow, so we're going to use this as our sample, but
Oh.
keep in mind you can do this with almost any of the climbing plants that you can think of.
I'm just noting some roots already. This has been lying on the ground. I
Yes,
think.
exactly. So hence where serpentine layering probably arose was when people noticed that many climbing plants, if a branch tends to lie along the ground, they'll often root as they go. So what we're doing is we're going to try and make a number of new plants by artificially pinning this plant down into a series of pots. So you can use one possible stem and end up with perhaps a dozen or 2 dozen new plants once they take root.
Fantastic. Okay, let's get to some basics. Firstly, you've said this technique is really best only for climbing plants.
Well, you could use it for some things with very soft stems. So some shrubs and things that are very
Lolloping.
lax and lolloping around all over the place could well be done as well.
Anything with radicans as its suffix.
Well, that could work well, actually. So, yeah, so lots of plants can be serpentine layered. It's just a matter of the physical, making sure that they go down into the containers you're doing them in so that they've got something to root down into.
So we'll get to that then. Second point is, if we're just talking about climbing plants, the season to do it. Is it specific to the type of plant, or is there a general time of year to do it?
It's not really plant specific, although I do tend to find that if you layer down in the autumn winter, when the naturally damper cycle is coming on, then you don't have to keep your layers as moist as you would if you did it in midsummer, because the pieces that are down into the potting mix have to be kept damp all the time.
Yeah.
So obviously if you layer them down in the winter, you might actually have some root initiation before the late spring, early summer comes in which case you won't have to keep them quite as damp. But that's probably the only sort of proviso I would put on it.
Okay. And then just in terms of equipment, can we just look at the pots you're suggesting we use?
All right, well, I've got the pot that is the one that the original plant's growing in, which is just a 20 centimetre nursery pot. And it doesn't really matter what that pot is, it's whatever you've got the plant growing in.
And it could also be growing in the garden, because we will in a minute go and see your Lapageria in your garden, which is obviously growing in the ground, and you're using this technique there. So we'll get to that.
Yeah, so it doesn't need to be in a pot necessarily, yes.
What I'm noticing though is that you've got quite long pots. Can we pull one out and just show the people?
Yes, I'm using reasonably long, these are sort of, I think, olive pots, so for baby olive trees. And the reason for that is that when you put your layer in, you can get it down reasonably deeply, but still have lots of potting mix below it, which you can root into. And that way, when you cover it over, it tends to hold in place better. It's not so likely to pop out of the ground.
Yeah, okay.
So you need to get it down into the pot as far as you can.
So that shape is ideal, something long and narrow.
Yeah, and of course, being a square pot too, I can pack them into a box. I've just got an ordinary polystyrene box here, so that they're also nice and tight in the box, so you don't get movement, which could then pop the cutting or the layer out of the pot. So you need everything to be as stable as possible.
All right, well, without further ado, then I'm going to spin the camera around and we're going to observe the technique.
Yes.
All right, Stephen, it's easier for me to be on this side of the camera. Now, first thing, what we're going to do?
All right, well, we need to put some potting mix into the bottom of the pots.
Now, it's probably logical, but that's about 2/3 full. Why?
Well, I just think that's about the right depth to be able to put more potting mix on top once the layer is in there to hold everything in place. So if it's about, I'd say it's probably closer to half than 2/3. But anyhow, once I get the layer down into there, especially if I can push it down against the corners of the pot, fill it over with fresh potting mix, then that will hold everything in place.
Right. And what potting mix are you using? Anything special?
No, well, I'm just using my general commercial potting mix, so it's the same mix I would use to pot up plants. It's the same mix I use to raise seed in. In fact, it's the same mix I use for everything. So it's a well-drained potting mix. It's a soilless mix, and it has micronutrients and things through it, although it has no fertilizers added. So if I feel the need to add some fertilizers, I would do that afterwards. But if you look down into the pot, you can see where the potting mix is. So it is about halfway up the pots, and it's just loosely put in place, ready to house the next Trachelospermum.
Okay, Stephen, so with this particular plant, which bit of it are you going to use for this serpentine layering?
All right, well, I need a longish piece because it's going to have to go into several pots. In fact, I reckon I've got enough here to do all of the pots with the one main stem. The big trick is it's not so much about the older wood at the bottom of the stem or even the younger wood at the top, but you've got to make sure that there are at least one, preferably two, and maybe even three nodes that are going to be buried below ground level. Because what's likely to happen is once they take root, they'll root at all the nodes, and in fact I could end up with 3 plants in each pot. So this can become then quite a profitable way of in fact propagating this plant to get quite a few, because when I repot them I can cut them up to the nodes because there'll be shoots that'll have come from each node, roots that'll have come from each node, and so quite literally I will have potentially 3 independent plants per pot.
And just for anyone who's unsure what a node is, I think here is a great example. So it's basically where a leaf was.
Yes, that's exactly right. And there's always dormant buds at that point, and it's where the meristematic tissue is that will initiate callus tissue and then initiate root system from there. So some people will suggest you nick the stems to expose a bit more cambium tissue. You can do that, but I find with thin-stemmed things like Lapageria and some of these other climbers, they root perfectly well without damaging the stem, and sometimes if you try and put nicks in the stem, that weakens the stem and then you snap it when you're trying to serpentine layer. So I don't nick the stems, I just leave them as they are.
All right, Stephen, so we've got our plant, we've got our pots, What next?
All right, well, it's actually surprisingly simple technique. All you have to do is bring your stem down, and it doesn't matter whether you cover a few leaves or what have you, and push it down into the pot like so, and then you just cover it. So the thing is to poke it down into the pot nice and hard so that it holds that stem in place. And I've buried 3 nodes in there. There's a couple of little bits of leafy stuff sticking up. I don't worry about the leaves, whether they're there or they're not there. It's all about the nodes, and if you bury a few leaves, they'll eventually die and fall off anyway, so it's not necessarily a problem. And you just keep doing the same thing. So the trick is to try and do them in some sort of numerical order so that you're not trying to push them back on themselves too quickly. So the next pot will be the next one right next door, and I will just poke it down in there, push like mad to get the base of the cutting in there, or the base of the stem, and then again bury it and make sure it's reasonably firmly entrenched, and you just keep doing the same thing. So I'll have to untangle some of this stem here, which has got quite into its own space, which is not where I want it to be, and I will then poke this one right down into there, and you can see how the square pot actually helps hold the stem in place, and again fill it, and you just keep doing this, picking on basically one stem. I might add, if you've got multiple stems that go down in the pot, that even gives you more nodes that you could probably get roots on. So in theory, by having 2 or 3 stems down in the pot, you could in fact end up with half a dozen or more plants from your propagating efforts. So you just keep going across like this. Because all the pots are nice and tightly ensconced in the box, they're not going to move terribly much, and I just keep pushing away until I've filled, in this case, all 11 of the little square pots I've put in place, and I will have potentially a quite reasonable commercial quantity of this Trachelospermum unknown species by the time I have finished doing all the pots.
But of course, not everyone's a commercial grower, Stephen.
No, well, that's...
But the evil face of capitalism must come into botany at some point.
Well, of course, and we all need to be able to propagate our plants in one way or another, and at least with this technique, although you're not going to produce vast quantities, you will easily produce enough plants to keep you entertained and, with any luck, some of your relatives as well. And I was going to say the other thing to keep in mind too is, as you pointed out before, Matthew, some of these have actually got a few roots hanging off them where they've touched the ground in the shade house. If I bury those pieces, I will actually get a new plant almost immediately. So within weeks, I'll probably have new roots initiating from where the old roots were. And now I've run out of stem. So I will then pull one of these ones from the side that I'd put out of my way, and suddenly they become the dominant ones that go down into the pot. And here we go. We've almost got to the end. So pushing that one around like so, and down into the pot. As I said, doesn't matter if you bury some leaves, just got to make sure that you get at least 2 or 3 nodes down in the pot. Now finally, I'm just going to push this last little bit in that's got quite a lot of branches in it, but they're all fine and small. And if I bury that in there, push it down nice and hard, that pot could in fact produce lots. Now the only other thing you've got to keep in mind is that now that I've done that, you've got to keep it damp.
Now, it's interesting,
Yes.
just the way that you've managed this, which is the mother plant and then these squarish pots in this polystyrene container. So from your perspective, you would leave it like this while all this process is happening?
Yes, I won't now disturb this again. Once I see some growth initiating, which then could suggest to me there might be some root initiation at the same time, I might give it a little liquid feed or put a little bit of slow release fertilizer around it.
Right.
But until that point, I probably wouldn't do too much, because the other thing you've got to keep in mind is that if something initiates roots, if you feed it, it doesn't then need to initiate lots more roots because it's taking up the nutrients that's there. So that's the same principle that follows through with doing things from cuttings. You put them in a fairly inert mix so that when the roots form, they go rushing out looking for nutrients so that you get a good root. Yeah. So I won't generally feed this, but what I will do is keep it quite moist. And if it's at all possible, and this is probably asking for the best of all worlds, if you can keep the parent plant slightly on the drier side and your serpentine layered pieces extra moist, that also helps it to initiate roots because it's looking for a way of perpetuating itself.
Cunning, slightly cruel.
Yeah, slightly cruel.
Cunning.
And it sort of works particularly if you're doing layering in the open ground. You let your parent plant stay reasonably dry and it's got its roots down, so it'll probably survive quite well. But you water the layers really well, and that will help to encourage good root system.
Well, interesting you mention this, because we are now going to step back down the mountain to your garden where you have been serpentine layering Lapageria.
Yep.
Let's go and have a look.
Well, here we are in my own garden where I've done some serpentine layering of one of my Lapagerias. The reason I'm doing it here is because I've only got this variety in the garden at home. And so it has to be done in situ because it's still got to be attached to the parent plant. So there's a dozen layers potentially there, although having said that, some of them might even produce more than one plant. So given enough time, I'll have a whole batch of this particular Lapageria, which is a South American selection called Colibri. Now, these layers were only done about 2 months ago, and they will probably still be here in another 12 to 18 months before there will be enough root system on the bottom of them to then separate them from the original parent plant and to have them as independent young Lapagerias. So one can understand why Lapagerias are not cheap to buy. There's not really a way to test whether they've worked because you can't really tug at them or anything, because if in fact they haven't taken root, you're likely to pull the whole piece out of the pot. So it's more a matter of once they start to send up shoots from the pot, then you've got to hope that they've also produced roots as well. It's not always the case, but normally is. And of course, at some point or another, you'll be able to pick up the pot and you'll be able to see roots coming out the bottom. By that time, you'll have a well-established Lapageria.
Now, we spoke about how long Lapageria might take, which is 12 to 18 months, which is a lot of commitment and patience.
Hence the expensive one when you buy it.
The expense.
Yes, yeah.
But what about this
All right.
gentleman?
Trachelospermum, I've done this before. If you do it in midwinter, you've generally got pots that you can separate from the parent plant well before the next autumn. So 6, 7 months.
Okay.
And when you do, this is the other thing that I must stress about serpentine layering, when you do cut it away from the parent plant, you don't disturb it in the pots initially. So you cut the main stems.
That was going to be my question. Would you sort of separate them? If you've got multiple plantlets, would you at that point separate them? But no.
No, I'd leave them in the propagating pot that you started them off in, let them resettle themselves, because once they've been taken away from the parent plant...
The umbilical cord's been cut.
Exactly, so they're not getting nutrients from the parent plant. That's a good time then to actually feed them, give them a little bit of extra help, and just leave them in those pots probably until the following winter, because that's a good time to disturb things. So if you wanted to break them up into multiple plants, because in most cases I'll end up with more than one plant per pot, then I would break them up, disturb them, cut them into individual plants with roots and stems, and do that in the following winter. So it'll still take a good 12-month cycle to get to the point where you're potting well-grown young plants.
Yeah. Now, I guess the million-dollar question is, when do you cut the umbilical cord? And it will depend on plant from plant.
Oh,
so
yes.
With the Lapageria, you were saying like it could be 12 months.
It could
plus.
easily be 12. It's more likely to be 18 months or more.
So when can you kind of tell by looking that you're ready to snip?
All right. Well, you should have good growth initiation from the top for a start. And because these are nicely packed in here, I'll probably be able to pick up one once they've been in the pots for a fair while and just see if any roots are coming out the bottom. Because the stems are well down into the pot, any root initiation will go to the bottom of the pot reasonably quickly. And so as soon as I see a good sign of growth and potentially some root activation in the pots, that's the time I can start severing them from the parent plant.
And with this particular jasmine then, how long do you think that would be?
Oh, with this plant, I should be able to sever them from the parent plant, I'd say, by late summer. So we're doing them in the winter, so 7 or 8 months down the track, probably.
Okay. Fascinating. Well, there we are, Stephen. Another revelation of your horticultural secrets.
And I might add, it's one that you don't need any fancy equipment for. You don't need to have mist spray systems or bottom heat or all those things that you might need for other propagating techniques. So you can be quite basic about the equipment you're going to need to create new plants via serpentine layering.
And your point you were just making to me was...
Oh yes, make sure that you put a label in it with the name of the plant, obviously, and the date that you did your layers, so that once you've separated them from the parent plant, you've got a sense then of the individual varieties' length of requirements to be left in the propagating pots, so that the next time you do them, you know that it's going to take approximately 6 months or it's going to take approximately 9 months. And so even if you haven't got a huge amount of root initiation, or top initiation, I should say, in the plants, you know that they should be well rooted by a certain time. So keeping proper records is a good idea.
Yes. Now we're again by 2 climbers, so another jasmine here.
Yes, the Trachelospermum jasminoides tricolour, with its weird pink and white variegation.
Which is beautiful. And then this fantastic Brazilian creeper, which is just about...
Well, it's almost naked now, so there's not a lot of beauty about it at the moment, but we have used it in at least one other video. It's a thing from Brazil called Heteroteres glabra, and lovely yellow flowers, lovely red seeds.
And would you use the same technique with this Brazilian?
There's no reason why you couldn't, but I generally raise it from seed. It seems to propagate from seed quite easily. So I tend to find if I can raise something from seed or cuttings, you can do them in larger batches than you could by any form of layering. So if that is a technique that works for that plant, then I'm more likely to fall back on that technique, and I'd use the serpentine layering for things that can't be grown in other ways as easily. So you've just got to tailor it.
And I didn't count, but how many pots did you have with the Lapageria?
There are a dozen pots in each box, I think. No, half a dozen pots in each box. They're much bigger ones that I used for the Lapageria at home.
Why was that?
Well, partially it was due to the fact that it's easier to keep moisture up to a bigger pot when it's not under sprinklers and things, because it's out in the garden at home. Here, if I was doing it in the shade house or something, the sprinklers would come on every night, so I wouldn't have to think about watering in the summer. But at home, because I'm going to have to hand water it as the weather gets warmer, the bigger pots will hold moisture better. So that's why I've done it. It also means the Lapagerias can be left alone that little bit extra long to get a bigger, gutsier plant before you disturb them.
And what colour is the one at home that you're layering?
Oh, it's one of the very rare bicolours. So it's one that has white flowers with cerise red picoteed edges around it, called Colibri.
I have to put my name on one of those.
Yeah, well,
Serpentine.
got to get them with their own roots first.
Well, you know, by the time they've rooted, our house will be finished. So
Oh, that's true. Yeah, so you might be able to get
there's
one
something to live for.
Yeah, exactly.
And what else is to live for is our video next week.
Yes, exactly. And we'll be doing something else in horticulture. Who knows what it will be? But I hope everybody's enjoyed this one on serpentine layering.
Absolutely. Now, if you have any questions about this, but also anything, do put them in the comments below because Stephen will answer them. And general questions we will answer every Monday in our shorts.
Yes, so don't forget to tell me where you're from though.
Absolutely. And we will answer those every Monday and we'll see you next Friday.
Bye all.